The wind over the Veilcrest moor did not just blow. It bit, carrying the salt of the distant sea and the rot of damp earth. Seraphina Veilcrest leaned into the gale, her fingers curled like frozen claws around the splintered handle of a rusted iron bucket. Every step through the knee-deep mud was a symphony of agony, a rhythmic reminder of how far the Duchess of Thornfield had fallen. She still wore the dress, the high-saturation emerald silk she had been wearing the night the guards dragged her from the manor. Now, the hem was a ragged fringe of grey grime, and the bodice was stained with the soot of a peasant's hearth. To any passing traveller, she was merely another broken woman of the countryside, but Seraphina carried her head with a terrifying, stoic confidence that no amount of poverty could erode. She was not surviving, she was waiting. When she reached the threshold of the crumbling stone cottage, she paused. The interior was a study in shadows, illuminated only by the dying amber glow of a peat fire. There, sitting on a low wooden stool, was the reason the world still turned. 7-year-old Cashin was polishing a small, heavy object with a piece of sheep's wool. As the firelight flared, it caught the gold-stitched silk of his inner tunic, the only garment Seraphina had never allowed to touch the mud. Around his neck hung the secret pendant, a heavy gold sunburst that had belonged to the Thornfield line for 10 generations. The Duke believed it had been lost in the chaos of her banishment. In reality, it was the ticking clock of his downfall. "The water is cold today, Mother," Cashin said, his voice possessing a hauntingly calm cadence that made him seem far older than his years. He looked up, and the breath caught in Seraphina's throat, as it did every morning. He had Damien's eyes, piercing, slate-grey, and cold enough to freeze a man's blood, set into a face of porcelain nobility. "The cold is a teacher, Cashin," Seraphina replied, her voice raspy from the winter chill but steady as iron. She set the bucket down, the water sloshing against her scarred ankles. "It reminds us that the heart must stay warm while the skin turns to ice." She moved toward him, her calloused hand coming to rest protectively on his shoulder. The visual was a jarring thermal clash, the mother in her ruined, mud-flecked finery, and the son, radiating a quiet, royal authority that made the dilapidated cottage feel like a throne room in waiting. Cashin tucked the gold pendant back beneath his shirt, the metal vanishing against his chest like a buried truth. "Is it time?" the boy asked, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon, toward the spires of the empire that had discarded them. Seraphina looked at his reflection in the dark water of the bucket, seeing not a bastard of the moors, but a weapon she had spent 7 years sharpening. "The Duke is bleeding, my son, and where there is blood, there are wolves. It is time we showed him who the true heir is." The memory did not come in fragments. It hit Seraphina like a physical blow, as cold and sharp as the sleet currently rattling against her cottage windows. Suddenly, the smell of peat smoke vanished, replaced by the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and extinguished candles. 7 years ago, Thornfield Hall had been a cage of white marble and black intentions. The night of glass began not with a scream, but with the sound of a heavy ledger slamming onto a mahogany desk. Duke Damien Thornfield stood silhouetted against a massive arched window, the midwinter gale outside mirroring the violence in his eyes. "I gave you my name, Seraphina," he had spat, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in her very bones. "I gave you my protection, and in return, you bring a bastard into my lineage." Seraphina had stood her ground, her hand instinctively fluttering to her still flat stomach. "He is yours, Damien. The rumors are poison, whispered by men who want your seat. Look at me." But he wouldn't look. He couldn't. To look at her was to acknowledge the vulnerability of his own heart, a heart he had decided to exhume and discard. He had snatched a heavy crystal decanter from the sideboard and hurled it. It didn't hit her, but it shattered against the doorframe, spraying her emerald silk gown with droplets of amber liquid and shards of razor-sharp glass. "The guards are waiting," he said, his back still turned. "You leave for the Veilcrest estate tonight. You will stay there until the child is born, and then you will vanish. If I ever see your face, or the face of that pretender, within the borders of this duchy again, I will not be so merciful." "Damien, please," she had whispered, the first and last time she would ever beg. "It is a blizzard. The carriage won't make the pass." "Then you had better start walking," he countered, finally turning. His face was a mask of aristocratic ice, devoid of the man who had once promised to burn the world down to keep her warm. The guards had been efficient, dragging her from the warmth of the manor into the howling white void of the storm. As the heavy iron gates of Thornfield slammed shut, the finality of the sound echoed like a funeral bell. It was in that moment, huddled in the corner of a drafty, unheated carriage as it lurched toward the desolate moors, that a strange, quiet heat began to bloom in her womb. The child kicked, a tiny, defiant pulse against her palm. In that freezing darkness, Serafina's tears turned to ice on her cheeks. She realized then that she was no longer a wife, and she was no longer a victim. She was a vessel for the Thornfield legacy, carrying the only thing that could eventually strip Damien of everything he held dear. She was alone, yes, but she was holding the winning hand. The quiet of the moors was broken not by thunder, but by the frantic rhythm of hooves striking wet stone. Serafina stood at the cottage threshold, her eyes narrowed against the grey mist as a rider collapsed from a lathered horse at the edge of her property. It was Barnaby, the one stable hand who had remained loyal enough to send word through the years, now pale and trembling as he gasped for air. "The hall has fallen, Grace," he wheezed, clenching a handful of his dirt-stained tunic. "The Duke's rivals, the Marbury faction, they didn't wait for the winter to break. They struck at midnight." Serafina felt a cold thrill of adrenaline, but her face remained a mask of emerald ice. She beckoned the man inside, her hand resting on Cassion's head as the boy watched the messenger with unsettling, predatory focus. "Damien is a wolf," Serafina said, her voice dropping into a low, melodic dangerousness. "He does not fall easily." "He was betrayed from within, my lady," Barnaby whispered, leaning against the damp stone wall. "They spiked the guard's ale and fired the east wing. The Duke is wounded, badly. I saw him stumbling through the gallery, his face a mask of blood, trying to reach the armory. But Marbury has the gates. They are calling him a tyrant, a man without an heir, a spent force whose line ends in the mud. They don't intend to just depose him, they intend to execute him by dawn to clear the way for their own claim." The stakes hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. If Damien died tonight, the Thornfield title would be declared extinct or seized by the crown, and the Marbury faction would hunt down any whispers of a hidden child to ensure their grip on the estate. Cassion's birthright was being burned to ashes alongside the tapestries of the Grand Hall. Serafina looked at her son. In the dim light, the gold pendant around his neck seemed to pulse with an inner heat. If they stayed, they were safe in their obscurity, but Cassion would remain a ghost of the countryside forever. If they went, they were walking into a slaughterhouse. "He discarded us to save his pride," Serafina murmured, her eyes flashing with a sudden, violent brilliance. "But he will find that only the ghost he cast out can save his empire." She didn't ask Cassion if he was afraid. She didn't need to. The boy stood, his small frame radiating a terrifying dignity that mirrored the man currently bleeding out in a marble hallway miles away. "Fetch the black carriage hidden in the lower barn, Barnaby," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a duchess who had finished her penance. "The Duke is dying, and his enemies are celebrating. It is the perfect time for a resurrection." The lower barn was a cavern of rot and shadows, smelling of ancient hay and damp timber. In its furthest corner, draped under a heavy, mouldering tarp, sat the last remnant of Serafina's former life, a mid-sized brougham carriage. It was stripped of its family crests and painted a dull, funerary black, but its bones were sturdy, built for the long miles of a journey that had no return. Serafina reached into the hidden lining of her tattered emerald bodice, her fingers brushing against something cold and hard. She pulled out a small velvet pouch, and from it she drew a single, breathtaking teardrop diamond. It was the starlight of Valecrest, a stone her father had given her on her wedding day. She had lived on thin soup and rainwater for years, watching her son grow thin in the winters, yet she had never touched this stone. It was not money for bread, it was the price of a kingdom. "Take it," she said, pressing the diamond into Barnaby's calloused palm. The gem caught the stray light of the barn, flashing with a brilliance that seemed to mock their surroundings. "Go to the village of Oakhaven. There is a man there with a team of black stallions and a royal-grade carriage for hire. Tell him the Duchess of Thornfield requires her escort. Do not haggle, simply pay and bring them back before the moon peaks." Barnaby stared at the diamond, his mouth agape. "My lady, this could buy an entire estate in the south. You could live in peace forever." "Peace is a luxury for those who have not been buried alive, Barnaby," Seraphina replied, her voice as sharp as a glass shard. "I am not buying a life, I am buying an entrance." As the stable hand disappeared into the mist, Seraphina turned to her son. She did not spend the remaining hours packing bags or weeping over their departure. Instead, she stood before a cracked mirror in the cottage, using the last of her clean rainwater to scrub the countryside grime from her face. She took a needle and thread, cinching her frayed emerald gown with a fierce, military precision until it sat upon her frame like armor rather than cloth. She began to braid her hair into a complex coronet style, a crown made of her own silver-streaked tresses. With every twist, the weary mother vanished, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the predatory stillness of a hawk. When the sound of heavy hooves and the rattle of high-quality iron wheels finally echoed outside, Seraphina stepped out into the rain. A magnificent black carriage, pulled by 4 powerful stallions, waited in the mud. The driver, seeing her stand there in her ruined silk and regal braid, instinctively removed his hat and bowed low. She wasn't returning to Thornfield to beg for a place at the table or to seek a husband's forgiveness. As she climbed into the plush velvet interior, she looked at Cashin, who sat opposite her with the gold pendant resting openly against his chest. "Tonight, Cashin," she whispered as the carriage lurched forward, "we do not ask for what is ours, we take it." The iron gates of Thornfield Hall groaned on their hinges, twisted and scorched by the night's violence. Outside, the world was a chaos of freezing sleet and shadows, but at the threshold, the air smelled of ozone and copper. Duke Damien Thornfield stumbled into the mud, his breath coming in ragged, wet rattles. One hand was pressed to a jagged wound at his ribs, his blood seeping through fingers that had once signed the laws of the land. Behind him, the shouts of Marbury's men echoed through the courtyard. The hounds had finally cornered the wolf. He collapsed against a stone pillar, his vision blurring. He was ready for the end. He expected the cold kiss of a blade or the finality of a musket ball. Instead, a wall of absolute silence fell over the moor. Through the curtain of rain, a pair of brilliant golden lanterns cut the dark. A pitch-black royal carriage, pulled by 4 massive stallions that looked forged from the midnight itself, rolled toward him with a steady, rhythmic thud that drowned out the sounds of the coup. It did not stop for the guards. It did not slow for the debris. It pulled to a halt exactly 3 paces from where the Duke lay in the dirt. Damien squinted, his heart hammering against his cracked ribs. No crest adorned the door, only a lacquered surface so dark it reflected his own ruined state back at him. "Marbury," he wheezed, thinking it a final taunt from his executioner. The carriage door opened. A heavy velvet-lined step dropped, hitting the mud with a sound like a gavel. First came the hem of a gown, emerald silk, frayed and stained, yet moving with a weight that commanded the earth to still. Then, Lady Seraphina Veilcrest stepped out into the storm. Damien's breath hitched. He had convinced himself she was a ghost of his own making, a spectre born of guilt and fever. But as she stood over him, the lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrifying, stoic confidence in her eyes. She did not look at him with pity. She looked at him as a judge looks at a condemned man. "You look small in the mud, Damien," she said, her voice cutting through the wind like a silver blade. Before he could speak, a small figure emerged from the carriage to stand beside her. A boy, no older than 7, stepped into the light. He was dressed in highborn silk, his posture an uncanny mirror of the man on the ground, as a massive lightning bolt arced across the sky. It caught the secret, gold sunburst pendant hanging from the boy's neck. The Duke's eyes widened, his hand trembling as he reached out toward the child who bore his own face. In that moment, the pain of his wounds vanished, replaced by a psychological chill that froze the blood in his veins. He had spent 7 years running from a lie, only to find the truth waiting for him at the gates of his own ruin. He hadn't just banished a wife. He had discarded the only thing that could save his empire from the fire. The rain continued to lash down, but for Duke Damien, The world had fallen into a terrifying, vacuum-like silence. He lay in the filth, his regal blood mixing with the grime of the drive, staring up at the boy who had just stepped into the golden glow of the carriage lamps. Cashin did not run to him. He did not cry out in fear at the sight of the carnage or the bloodied man at his feet. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was hauntingly familiar. He stopped just inches from his father's reaching hand, his small boots planting firmly in the mire. Then the boy looked down. It was the Thornfield stare, a chilling, unblinking gaze that had characterized the Duke's ancestors for centuries. It was a look of cold assessment, one that stripped away titles and pretenses until only the raw truth remained. In those slate-gray eyes, Damien saw no childish innocence. He saw a mirror reflecting his own cruelty, his own cowardice, and the 7 years of silence he had imposed upon his own flesh and blood. The Duke's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The logic of his world was fracturing. He had told himself for years that Serafina's child was a fraud, a product of betrayal that justified his coldness. But as he looked at the boy's high cheekbones, the stubborn set of his jaw, and the way he held himself against the storm, the lie shattered. There was no room for doubt. The boy was more of a Thornfield than Damien himself was in that moment. Cashin's silence was more deafening than any accusation. He simply watched the Duke struggle for breath, his expression an uncanny mask of aristocratic indifference. It was the ultimate status inversion. The man who had judged and banished was now being scrutinized by the very consequence of his judgment. Damien, Serafina's voice drifted down, cool and detached. You spent 7 years demanding proof. Look at him. Is this the face of a lie? A ragged sob caught in Damien's throat, half choked by the metallic tang of blood. The guilt hit him then, heavier than the wounds in his side. He had left this child to wither in the countryside, yet the boy stood before him like a young king, possessing a dignity Damien had forfeited the night he turned his back on them. As the shouts of Marbury's assassins drew closer, the Duke realized with a jolt of pure terror that his survival no longer mattered to the world. The boy was the reality now. Damien was just a dying memory, a man who had realized too late that the heir he had feared was the only salvation his legacy had left. The secret pendant on Cashin's chest glowed like a dying star, a beacon of a birthright that Damien no longer had the right to claim, yet desperately needed to save. The heavy thud of boots on stone and the orange flicker of torches against the manor's high windows signaled the closing of the trap. Marbury's men were pouring through the main foyer, their victory cries echoing like the baying of hounds. Serafina did not hesitate. She seized Damien by the collar of his ruined tunic, hoisting him up with a strength born of 7 years of hard labor. If you die now, you die a traitor and a failure, she hissed into his ear, her voice a sharp contrast to the thunder rolling overhead. Stand, for the boy you will stand. She didn't lead them toward the grand entrance, where the fighting was fiercest. Instead, she dragged the stumbling Duke toward the ivy-choked shadow of the west wing. Cashin followed closely behind, his face a mask of predatory calm as he gripped the hilt of a small silver dagger Serafina had tucked into his belt before they left the cottage. At a nondescript seam in the exterior stonework, Serafina pressed a concealed lever she had memorized during her lonely months as a young bride. A heavy slab of granite pivoted with a rusted groan, revealing a throat of darkness that smelled of damp earth and stale history. In now, she commanded. They moved through the narrow, suffocating veins of the manor, the serpent's passages designed by paranoid ancestors. Above them, the floorboards groaned under the weight of the usurpers. Shouts of "Find the Duke!" and the crashing of priceless porcelain vibrated through the stone walls. Damien slumped against the damp masonry, his breath coming in shallow, wet wheezes that threatened to betray their position. I can't," Damien gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Leave me, Serafina, take the boy and go." Serafina turned on him, her emerald gown a dark shadow in the gloom. She pressed her hand over his mouth, her eyes flashing with a violent, diamond-hard light. "You misunderstand me, Damien. I do not care if your heart beats another hour for your own sake, but my son requires a living father to sign the abdication. He requires a legitimate predecessor to hand him the crown before the ton. You will not die until you have served your purpose as his footstool." The Duke looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the true depth of the monster he had created in the countryside. She was no longer his wife. She was a strategist who viewed him as a vital, disposable asset. A sudden crash echoed from the passage behind them, a door being kicked in, followed by the light of a lantern spilling into the tunnel. The hunters had found the hive. Serafina grabbed Cassion's hand and heaved Damien forward into the dark, her mind already 3 steps ahead in a game where the Duke was the prize, and she was the only player who knew the rules of the house. The damp air of the crypt tunnels felt like a shroud as they reached the iron-bound door of the Duke's private study from behind the tapestry. Above them, the sounds of Marbury's men tearing through the library grew frantic. Serafina shoved Damien into a leather chair, the Duke's face ghost-white against the dark wood. He was fadding, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if inviting the end. "Look at me, Damien," Serafina commanded, her voice a low, vibrating chord. She didn't reach for bandages. Instead, she reached into the hidden pocket of her emerald gown and pulled out a yellowed, blood-flecked envelope. "You cast me out because of a letter, a confession of infidelity that arrived on the eve of the midwinter gale. You recognized the seal, you recognized the hand." Damien's eyes flickered with a spark of old, bitter fire. "I saw the signature, your own hand, Serafina. You admitted the child was not mine." "I never touched a pen that night," she whispered, leaning into his space until their foreheads nearly touched. She snapped the letter open, holding it before his failing eyes. "Look at the flourish on the letters. Look at the way the ink pools at the base of the stems. It is a master's forgery, but a master leaves a fingerprint." She turned the paper over, pointing to a faint, embossed watermark visible only in the flickering light of the single candle she had lit. It was a crest of a broken tower. Damien's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound. "Marbury. The man currently crowning himself in your ballroom is the man who drafted your divorce by proxy," Serafina said, her voice dripping with a cold, triumphant poison. "He didn't just want your land, Damien. He wanted to ensure that the Thornfield bloodline was severed by your own hand. He fed your pride until it turned into paranoia. He watched you throw your pregnant wife into a blizzard, and he laughed while you did it." The Duke stared at the parchment, the realization hitting him harder than the blade in his side. The 7 years of exile, the rot of his own soul, and the hollow silence of his halls were all built on a lie constructed by the friend who had stood beside him as he signed the banishment papers. It wasn't just a betrayal of marriage, it was a long-game execution of his entire legacy. He looked up at Cassion, who stood by the door, watching the hallway with a chilling, silent vigilance. The boy was the living proof of Marbury's failure and Damien's own catastrophic stupidity. "I was a fool," Damien gasped, a single tear cutting through the dried blood on his cheek. "You were a weapon," Serafina corrected, her eyes devoid of mercy. "And now you are the evidence. Marbury thinks he is inheriting an empty house. He doesn't know the ghosts have come home to collect the debt." The double doors of the great hall burst open, the sound echoing like a cannon blast against the high vaulted ceiling. Lord Marbury stood atop the dais, a stolen ceremonial circlet held aloft as he addressed the remnants of the ton, the terrified nobles and opportunistic sycophants who had survived the night. His victory speech died in his throat as a vision of emerald and iron strode into the light. Serafina moved with the lethal grace of a queen returning to a conquered city. Behind her, supported by 2 loyal guards who had emerged from the shadows of the secret passages, stumbled Duke Damien. He was a ruin of a man, his chest bound in makeshift bandages, but his eyes were fixed with a terrifying clarity on the usurper. "The Duke lives," a voice cried out from the crowd, a ripple of shock turning into a deafening silence as Serafina stepped onto the dais. "He lives only long enough to correct a catastrophic injustice," Serafina declared, her voice ringing with a power that shook the chandeliers. She reached back and drew Cassion forward. The boy stepped into the center of the hall, the secret pendant glowing like a fallen star against his chest. The room exhaled a collective gasp. The resemblance was undeniable. The Thornfield lineage had been etched into the child's very bones. Marbury's face contorted, his hand flying to his sword. "A bastard, a country-born pretender brought to mock us in our hour of grief." The only pretender here is the man who forged a duchess's handwriting to steal a dukedom, Serafina countered, hurling the yellowed letter at the feet of the assembly. The duke has seen the truth, and now he will speak it. Damien was lowered into his throne, his breath shallow but his hands steady as he reached for the great seal of Thornfield. He looked at the boy, the son he had cast into the dark, and for a fleeting second, the cold duke's mask crumbled into raw, paternal agony. With a trembling hand, he dipped the quill into the inkwell brought forward by the chamberlain. He didn't sign a reprieve for himself, he signed the instrument of regency. The scratch of the quill was the only sound in the cavernous hall. As the duke pressed the heavy gold seal into the hot wax, he effectively stripped himself of his own power. He handed the document not to a lawyer, but to Serafina. "I, Damien Thornfield," he wheezed, his voice carrying to the furthest corner of the room, "recognize Prince Cashan as my sole, legitimate heir, and until his majority, I name Lady Serafina Veilcrest as regent, with total authority over the Thornfield lands and life." Marbury was seized by the guards before he could flee, but no one watched his descent. Every eye was fixed on Serafina as she took the stolen circlet from the altar and placed it upon her son's head. The boy did not flinch. He looked out at the nobility of England with the cold, silent judgment of a true heir, while beside him, the woman the world had forgotten stood as the most powerful figure in the realm. The debt of 7 years had been paid in full. The sun over Thornfield Hall no longer felt like a cold, judgmental eye. It was a gilded spotlight reflecting off the pristine marble of a restored empire. 5 years had passed since the night of the lightning and the blood, and the memory of the desolate Veilcrest moors had faded like a bad dream, save for the calluses on Serafina's hands, which she wore now as a badge of her sovereign power. Serafina sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, her gown a shimmering, unburdened emerald that put the lush gardens outside to shame. She did not lead with a soft touch. She ruled with the tempered iron of a woman who had been forged in the furnace of betrayal. Beside her, 12-year-old Cashan sat with his back perfectly straight, his grey eyes scanning the ledgers of the duchy's grain exports with the chilling efficiency of a veteran strategist. He was no longer the secret heir, he was the sun around which the nobility orbited. At the far end of the table sat a shadow. Damien Thornfield, the man who had once commanded the world with a snap of his fingers, was now a silent passenger in his own life. The wounds from the coup had healed into jagged scars, but the spirit of the old duke had never truly returned from the mud at the gates. He sat in a high-backed chair, his gaze drifting toward the window, looking out at the road he had once forced his wife to walk. He was treated with the formal respect due to a figurehead, but he was a ghost haunting his own halls. He lived by Serafina's permission, ate by her grace, and breathed because her son found it useful to have a living lineage. "The Marbury lands have been fully integrated, Mother," Cashan said, his voice deep and steady. "The last of the conspirators' families have been stripped of their titles. The debt to the crown is settled." Serafina smiled, a slow, sharp expression that never quite reached her eyes. "Good. Let the world remember that a Thornfield never forgets a debt, and a Veilcrest never forgets a face." She looked at Damien, who offered a small, vacant nod, his once formidable pride now nothing more than a thin veil over a broken heart. He had his life, but he had lost his world. Serafina had achieved the ultimate status inversion. She was the architect, the regent, and the victor. The countryside was a memory, but the lessons of the cold had stayed with her, ensuring that the new empire she built was as unshakable as the stone of a Gothic citadel. As the servants moved in silent synchrony to clear the plates, Serafina looked directly into the middle distance, as if challenging the very fates that had once tried to crush her. The storm was over, but the reign of the resilient victor had only just begun. If you craved this journey of high-stakes accountability and royal redemption, don't miss our next cinematic feature. What happens when a discarded princess returns to claim a throne she was never supposed to touch? Subscribe now to witness the next revenge saga.